to our session this afternoon. Effective Project Management with LabVIEW Projects. My name is Paul Herrmann. I'm Senior Vice President, General Manager with Surtech. We're an alliance partner based in Kansas City, and we have offices in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and Cedar Rapids, Iowa. And we have Ryan Smith.
My name is Ryan Smith. I am a Senior Staff Engineer for Surtech. I'm also a CLA, Certified LabVIEW Architect, Certified Tester and Architect, Certified LabVIEW Embedded System Developer, and a Certified Professional Instructor for National Instruments. Kind of the roles we're going to be taking on today is Paul is going to be talking to you about kind of the management side of project management. And I'm going to be talking to you more about the technical side of project management. So I'll be talking some about LabVIEW. He's going to be talking more about the project as a whole. How do you manage that project? So how many of you here are here from the management side? Okay, so I'm seeing maybe 15%. How many of you for the technical side? A lot of you. Now, how many of you do both? That's kind of what I thought.
Okay, very good. Well, today we're going to talk about setting up your project plan and identifying the requirements for your project. We want to go through defining a work breakdown structure, and then as you set up the plan, then stepping into looking at the LabVIEW architecture that you want to set up. And we'll take into consideration the resources, the staff that you have that will be working on the project, along with the complexity of the project that you have to implement. And then we'll talk about monitor and control, where you're actually working on the project, you're doing the work, and what are some ideas, what are tips and tricks to successfully implement the project, communicate with your stakeholders, and manage risk and scope creep to make sure that you get your project ideally, hopefully done on time, in budget, and with full feature set, with top quality. So, as you think about the objectives and assumptions that you want to identify in your project, I'm going to look at the big picture and make sure that everybody in your team understands what it is, what the project is about. So, you also want to identify items that you don't have control over. So, for example, if there are long lead items that you have to purchase, or maybe there are specialty connectors that you've got to interface to a device under test, those kinds of things. Identify those early on so you can try to mitigate the risk those might present. Sometimes you're dependent on customer supplied materials or information. Maybe it's some of the testing information you need, some of the specifications about how the system should work. It might be some mechanical fixturing, different things that the customer's going to supply that you're dependent on. You want to identify those. You also want to look at the resources that you need for the project, whether it's the staff that you have on your team available to support your project, but also look at tools, whether you're going to use LabVIEW or TestStand or other tools to support your project. From a project management perspective, consider what tool you use to manage your project. So you could use Microsoft Project. It's kind of pricey. You could use an Excel spreadsheet. That works fine as well. At Surtech, we've been using a system called Smartsheets, and it's kind of a combination of Microsoft Project and Excel. It's pretty simple to use, but it gives you a nice Gantt chart along with the detailed structure for your work breakdown structure. You want to identify these three key things: what you want to get done, when you're going to do it, and how you're going to do it. So as far as the what to get done, you need to make sure that you've got good requirements defined. Maybe it's a statement of work that identifies all that you're going to do on your project. Maybe it's an interface control document that has a lot of technical details about the system you're developing. Maybe it's a product specification that will identify what your system's going to do. But work to get those requirements so everybody knows what your project is about. And then you're going to need to identify when, identify that completion date, the end date. One of Stephen Covey's highly effective habits of 7 habits of highly effective people states begin with the end in mind. So plan with, know what that end date is, and then work backwards from there with your schedule. And then how are you going to do it? What's your technical approach? What's your solution? What's your method of implementation for attacking that system? So as you think about the requirements for the project, there are the needs, the necessities, the things that you have to have. Those are definitely part of the statement of work, probably part of your contract. And then a lot of times you'll come across nice to haves. Once your clients, once your customers start seeing your implementation of the project, they'll say, oh, can I have this? Can I add that? And so you've got to be careful. You have to make sure everybody on your team is focused on what's within scope and what's really defined to be part of the scope of our project. When you start that scope creep and going outside those boundaries, as engineers and programmers, I think we want to, please the customer. And yeah, I can add that feature. The problem is, we do that at the expense of other things that are possibly requirements in the project, or then your costs start to increase, or you miss your schedule.
How many of you as engineers have said before, wow, it'd be really great if, and you headed off on this path, only to find out, wow, I'm 2 days into this, nice to have, and I'm way off track. So you got to bring that back in and try to stay focused and stay on track. And if it's really worth having, take it to the customer. And maybe they approve doing something like that.
So for a fixed price contract, adherence to the statement of work is key, and keeping within those boundaries. As you start creeping outside that boundary, then you run the risk of, like I said, spending too much time, your costs go up, and you're doing work that's not authorized. So it's okay to share with your team as requests come in to add new features, push back. And by that I mean politely say, yes, we can do that, I'd like to do that, but I need authorization to do that extra work. And sometimes it's the engineer you're working with or the engineering manager that says, I've got funding, I approve it, go with it. But until you get the purchasing agent involved, until the buyer gives you that approval, you want to hold off on doing that work. So think about scope changes and how you're going to handle those. And then, like I said, the trick is trying to get these three constraints that are in tension, that are competing with each other: cost, schedule, and quality. Sometimes we get toward the end of the project and the schedule is starting to slip, so you add more people on to try and meet that date. Well, then the cost goes up. Yes, sir.
How often do you deal with incomplete requirements?
Never!
The question was, how often do you deal with incomplete requirements? And that happens very often. We've had projects at Surtech where the customer will say, I want this system, but there aren't any real details or things lined out about how you should implement that. So we will actually create requirements and then say, here, what do you think about those? And then do a negotiation to come to settle on a set of requirements.
Well, and oftentimes, if the requirements are not well defined, it's hard to do a fixed price bid on that.
So you're talking fixed price mostly here.
It can go either way. But in the case of very undefined requirements, a lot of times we say, well, you either need to define your requirements or we need to talk about doing this as time and material.
So what about the customer changes their mind while
Okay.
you're working on the project?
Okay, yeah, so if the customer changes your mind, and I believe you addressed that a little bit later, but, that's something you're going to have to negotiate because that is a change in scope.
Right. With fixed price agreements, you agree to do a certain amount of work, no matter how long it takes. And so, you've got the responsibility. You own the risk. With time and materials, the buyer owns the risk. But scope still is important with time and materials agreements, because if there are 5 key items that they requested to be implemented in that time and materials agreement, and if you spend all your time doing other things and only got 3 of those things done, they're not going to be happy. So you really need to focus, even on time and materials agreements, you need to focus on what's in scope and make sure those get done first. With time and materials, I think you've got a little more flexibility. If you get those 5 done, you've got time left, then okay, let's start doing some of the nice-to-haves. So we've identified our, oh, yes?
Sorry. I'm just curious, do you guys typically quote time material or fixed? Because I think going into a project, it makes a big difference in how you're going to handle that project, actually. As far as requirements and how the project's going to proceed.
Right, so if we're working to come up with a test system for testing a product that's under development and still changing, it's very difficult for us to do a fixed price. And so we almost always go time and materials for that arrangement.
But to your point, we probably would treat it differently depending on what the customer has set up front. Hey, we're going to do this time and materials. So we might say, okay, we don't need as much requirements, but we still do need a scope of work. So
We do a discovery phase. We've added that as a first phase to almost all of our projects.
right. So his point was, oftentimes if the requirements are not well defined, you might say, I tell you what, we will engage you on a discovery phase where we determine what the requirements are. And a lot of times that is a paid discovery, and that's a negotiated thing that you go through with the customer. And that's a great point.
So hopefully you've got requirements in place. Now we're going to take a look at the project plan. And you want to get everybody on your team focused on the same target and create a work breakdown structure. So you've got milestones in place. So if you've got maybe a 6-month project, maybe your milestones come up about once a month or once every 6 weeks. It could be things like conceptual design, detailed design, software development, putting your hardware together, doing that integration phase, and then a final testing and verification phase. And all along that way, you're doing documentation. You want to prepare for risks as you work on this work breakdown structure. Problems will come up. Parts won't come in on time, or items that you needed to be delivered from your client get delayed, don't come in. So you need to have a mitigation strategy in place to deal with those risks. Come up with a contingency plan. Also, as you're setting up the work breakdown structure, focus on estimates based not on the calendar, a 1-day or 1-week effort, but really try to analyze, okay, this task is going to take 12 hours, or I estimate it'll take 20 or 32 hours, something like that. A little more details about the work breakdown structure, the WBS. You want to start at the high level, some of those interim milestones that I talked about, and then break it down into smaller chunks. Go from a boulder to a rock to a pebble, and get really kind of detailed in, okay, you're going to create the software, and so you'll come up with an architecture plan, a software requirements document, maybe a software test plan. You'll actually write up your code, and then do testing on that code. You're going to do reviews. Whatever artifacts might be part of the project, then you want to include in this work breakdown structure. The whole goal is that this will be a guide or template or roadmap as you work the project and you make assignments to others on the team. And it just helps you remember all the different things that you need to take care of. You want to consult the work breakdown structure on a periodic basis. I would recommend weekly, if not daily. And it can be a guide for each of your team members to focus on, here's what I'm going to work on today, is focus on this task to get us to the next interim milestone to then get to the end of the project.
So I'm going to talk just a little bit about the LabVIEW side. After all, we are talking about effective project management in LabVIEW. One of the things that you really need to do up front is choose your LabVIEW architecture. Now, how many of you have done Actor Framework? How many of you have looked at Actor Framework and went, no? Okay, Actor Framework is great, don't get me wrong. It is complicated. And once you figure it out, it clicks. But until you get it figured out, it's going to take some struggling. So my point is that don't make your architecture any more complicated than it needs to be. So, you know, producer, consumer is fine. Queued state machine is very, very popular. You could also do a custom framework. I know some of you might use JKI state machine. So the other thing that this does is by using an architecture that's quote unquote off the shelf, you're going to reduce your time to market. You know, you're going to, why reinvent the wheel? Why do we have to do these things over and over? So keep that in mind. But remember, if you make it overly complicated, how many people can maintain this? If you write it in Actor Framework, and you're the only person in your company that can understand Actor Framework, or you're handing it off to a customer, and the customer is going to maintain this, don't make it so complicated that they can't maintain it. You know, there's a little bit of, you know, I can get more work because they have to come back to me, job security kind of thing. But in the end, your customer is not going to be happy with that because they intended to take it on themselves. How many of you are familiar with this nice little triangle here? Yeah. So this is talking about the certification levels for LabVIEW. Now, we're talking about LabVIEW, but the same thing kind of applies when we talk about things like test stand. So what you want to do is you want to define your project roles. Okay. As a CLA, what you might do is define the architecture, provide the framework. So we said we were going to work in, you know, a queued state machine or something like that. But let's go ahead and get the framework that we're building around that. And then you're supposed to watch over and give guidance upon the implementation. Now this is where your CLDs and your CLADs might come in. So they're going to implement the detailed coding tasks under the supervision of the CLA. Now it's a pyramid for a reason, because we can have lots of CLADs and we can have lots of CLDs. But as you go further up, you don't need as many. So, you know, you only need a few people determining what your architecture is going to be, but you need lots of people to help, perhaps help implement those tasks. So, talking about tasks, I think it's very important to track to the task. So, you know, as Paul's mentioned before, you know, you break these things down, you look at them, you make sure you have an estimate for these, but you really need to track to those tasks individually. So if you think it's going to take, you know, 20 hours to write this driver to communicate with this piece of hardware, track to that task. Now, keep in mind that percent of hours does not equal percent complete. How many of you have gotten to where you've gobbled up 90% of your hours and you're only halfway done? Yeah. Me? Yeah. Now, it can go the other way too, you know, and that's when you really hope you did firm fixed price. So, you know, it's just because you consumed hours doesn't mean you're done. And then at the end of the project, it's a good idea to review that task data. So we tracked to the task, we knew what we estimated, we knew what it took us. Okay, so what did we learn? Where did we do really well? And where did we do not so well? Did we learn that FPGA took us a little longer than we thought? And did we learn that using off-the-shelf architectures worked really well? So that's some of the data you need to glean by reviewing that data at the end. Reviews. Okay? Reviews are very important. Again, we're talking about from kind of a coding perspective. It's very important to establish a set of coding standards. There have been coding standards posted on NI.com in the past, but just kind of how is the company going to operate? How are we going to write code? Now remember, in order to review the functionality of code, you must have a set of requirements. Okay, so we talked earlier, you know, what do you do if you don't have requirements? You write requirements. Okay, so if the customer's not going to provide them, maybe you need to write them yourself. Unit testing is always a good idea. Some people require unit testing, some don't. But one of the things that we're noticing is that if we go ahead and we write unit tests for our code, it's also a very good example of how the code is intended to be used. So if you write up a bunch of functions, then you write up a bunch of unit tests to test those functions, you can go back and the next guy that's trying to implement this function, they can go, oh, I see what you did when you wrote up these unit tests. And I would store those somewhere around where you store your reviews to kind of prove and have an artifact that you did test this code.
Sorry, what do you mean by unit testing? I mean unit of the software or unit of the hardware?
A code module. So the question was, what do I mean by unit testing? Take the code module itself, so let's call it a function, and kind of run it through its paces. Do some boundary conditions. What happens if I exceed this and go below that, and put some unexpected data in there, just to kind of verify that the code model works. And that's a really deep subject. We could probably do a whole presentation just on unit testing. And there are some unit test frameworks out there. NI's got one. I believe JKI's got one. So, and you know, you don't have to exhaustively test it if it's not required, but it does help you give good confidence that your code works and a good example for people going forward. Now, what I try to think of when I'm doing a review is reviewing is also a great opportunity to mentor. How many of you thought flat sequences were a great idea when you started doing LabVIEW? And how do we learn that that's not a great idea? It either fails on us immediately, or somebody else shows us the error in our ways. So again, use it as an opportunity to mentor, an opportunity to guide. Hey, don't use local variables all over the place. That's a bad idea.
Okay, so we started off talking about requirements, gathering requirements and identifying your project plan, the WBS and the details, the tasks listed out. Ryan's talked about the LabVIEW architecture that you select. Now we're actually getting into the meat of running the project. You're trying to monitor progress and then actual implementation of the project. Some of the pitfalls that could come up would include lack of information, kind of to the point about what do you do when you don't have requirements. And that's not necessarily just the beginning. As you work through the project, some of the implementation details may come into question, and you need input from others, and there may be a void or a vacuum in the response that you get. So I recommend being a squeaky wheel. You call and leave voicemails, you send emails, and a lot of times, if you've got a good relationship and they respond, that's great, you get the information you need. But if not, then after a couple days, maybe a week, hit them up again. And just continue, be that squeaky wheel, be persistent until you get the information or the materials that you need. Work to eliminate inefficient activities. So sometimes the engineers want to break from what they're doing, and I find them out in the lab and they're soldering on a print circuit board, or they're building a cable. Maybe they're assembling some mechanical hardware. Maybe doing some drafting work. So if you can keep your engineers, your programmers focused on the key tasks that they have assigned and the things they're best at, that you're paying them a lot of money to do, delegate those other tasks to others in the company. Sometimes we get stuck in the integration phase where we're getting the hardware and the software working together, and boy, you hit a tough problem, and you're going to get this, I'm going to get this, and then after, I don't know, hours or days, it's time to call in somebody else. And so talk to a peer and have somebody come take a look, and you kind of keep notes of what you've tried. I've tried these different things, and then they say, oh, well, did you try this? And just a fresh set of eyes, looking at it from a different angle, can make all the difference.
Yeah, I don't know how many times I've come over to a project to help another engineer, and you ask a dumb question that has nothing to do with the subject at hand, you know, couldn't possibly be that, but it fires that neuron, and they go, but I didn't do this. It has nothing to do with what you said. It's that you fired a neuron and helped them get past that stumbling block. And a lot of times this is, you know, we talked about your roles. Maybe this is where, you know, a CLD is struggling and they go to a CLA to get some advice.
And sometimes, just in the process of explaining what you've done, the troubleshooting methods you've gone through, an idea will come to your head. Also, manage your tasks, manage your daily tasks to the WBS. Consult that WBS and help that be your guide, your map, your focus of what you're working on. I think sometimes we get honed in on a piece of code we're working on, or a printed circuit board you're laying out, that kind of thing. And if we don't take a step back and just make sure that we're aware of what the interim milestones are coming up and keep our eye on the end goal, that end date, you know, we kind of forget. So daily, consult the WBS. It can be a guide for our work activities. Communication is a very important thing item to keep in mind and to practice when we're in the actual implementation phase. Develop some kind of communication method, whether you're going to have a wiki page and come up with your method for configuration management control of your software. We use Subversion. Check your work in daily at the end of the day. Determine what kind of meetings, what kind of teleconferences you're going to have with external clients. And project management experts recommend that you have at least weekly communications where you're communicating with your team, where you're communicating with stakeholders, progress on the project, how you're doing with completing tasks, how you're going with your burn rate on your engineering hours and your materials spend. Sometimes at the beginning of a project, you're maybe front-loaded and you've got this chart that's going off you're going to be way overspent, but sometimes that's appropriate, and you note that. But hey, up front, we've got extra work going on, but it's going to flatten out after a while. Or maybe you're going to find that I don't have, to Ryan's point earlier, you spent 90% of your hours, you only have 50% of the work done. Raise the flag. But communicate with management, with the team members, with clients about issues that are going on and progress that you're making. Have a risk log and identify risks and possible mitigation plans. So we just completed a project last week where a large piece of environmental equipment was coming from the client. It was supposed to get to our facility in March. And then they said, well, it's going to come in May. And we actually received it on July 6th. So it was crunch time. And so what we did, we knew that delay in equipment was coming, so we created a simulator, a little box that simulated the unit under test. And so we created all of our software and all of our testing systems, and we could run it with that simulator, flip the switch, simulate the unit doing a certain action, so that when the environmental testing equipment came in, we were able to hit the ground running, and we completed the project on time. So think of the risks, talk with your team members. I mean, the guys in the trenches that are doing the work, they're seeing the problems, and a lot of times a problem will come up and you get it resolved within a day or two, no biggie. But the problems that keep going, those are the ones you're concerned about, and if you just put your head in the sand, boy, those problems can come to bite you. Also, communicate about scope change. Again, like I said earlier, you want everybody on the team to be cognizant of what the boundaries are and what our responsibilities for this project. And when they're requested to do something outside that, then you say, wait, that's not within scope. Talked a little bit about risk. Again, you can have a risk log, identify, quantify, qualify which of the risks that you're tracking, communicate those, keep records of how you did. Did your mitigation strategy work? Were you able to come to a successful resolution for the issue? This can help on future projects when you look back at the log.
So one thing you might keep in mind too is Identifying risks up front can be very helpful when you're quoting a project. You know, identifying those risks, saying, hey, there is a potential for a problem here. You need to really leverage your experience that you've done in the past and say, you know, I've used this kind of equipment before, and these are the kind of issues we might come up against. And I hate to say it, but sometimes risk does impact price. The more risk I have to assume, if I think this could take me 20 hours or it could take me 200 hours, and it's fixed price, you're going to have to mitigate that risk somehow.
Yes?
How do you deal with unknowns on the site?
How do you deal with unknowns on the project? First, you have to identify what you don't know. I know some.
We don't know.
You don't know what you don't know. So, if you come across something that was a true unknown that you should have known, maybe that's on you. But if it's an unknown that maybe the customer didn't disclose something, I think that's when you have to go into the change of scope. Okay, so we identified that your unit has this problem, and we cannot proceed testing until you give us a solution. So at that point, you end up in a change of scope. Is that kind of...
Do you prioritize things that may be risky to do them first to get to know the risk?
Okay, so the question was, do you prioritize the things that might have risk and slide them forward in the project? And I think that's a valid thing to do. You know, hey, interfacing to this piece of equipment might be really hard. Let's make sure we can do that before we move forward. And that could also be a discovery phase. So you negotiate with the customer and you say, we know this could be risky. How about we do a little discovery phase project, little fixed price deal to find out how we can do that.
Yeah, I think in some project there is something called contingency money there. That's a good idea also in software projects. Just add some amount for unknowns.
Right. So his point was maybe you add a contingency buffer to your
Is that not common in software industry or not?
So whether or not it's transparent that that's what's happening, sometimes it's just a buffer that you add, saying, I'm going to mitigate my risk by putting a buffer in here.
But you can actually name it. That's the point. This is contingency.
You could. So if you plan to maybe push that money around for different parts, you could potentially, you know, it's whatever you negotiate with your customer.
Right.
We would like to add X amount of dollars of contingency, unknown. Especially if you're doing, well, I guess you could go on both fixed price and time and material. Yes, that's a great point.
And to your earlier question about prioritizing risks, there was a slide earlier where I didn't really talk much about the critical path. But when you've got that work breakdown structure and you've got predecessors and successors, then you can identify these are the things that are on my critical path to meet the end timeline. So I think prioritizing, making sure that you've got the highest risk items as your top priority, get your most attention, work those first, I think is a good plan. One other comment about the WBS. I think on a lot of projects we get toward the end. We know it's due this Friday, and it might have started last weekend where you burn the midnight oil and everybody's in a frenzy. We've got to work like crazy to get this project done by this Friday. If you can take that focus, that energy, that passion, and apply it at the interim milestones throughout the project to make sure that the conceptual design, the detail design, the software development, to make sure those all happen on time, then your chances of hitting that end date are much improved. If those interim dates start to slide, you end up compressing the schedule and you're getting all these things you have to get done right at the last minute, and it's very difficult to do. So I would recommend having the whole team involved with making sure they realize what the interim milestone dates are, so that everybody's pulling together to meet those interim dates to then for a higher chance of success of meeting that final date. We talked quite a bit about scope change. It's going to happen, so the main thing is to be prepared for it. And again, communication with your team, make them aware of what all the requirements are so they know what's in scope, what's out of scope. And again, politely push back when they're asked to do things that aren't in scope. We've had several contracts lately where it says in bold, all caps, it says, we're not authorized to invoice the client unless we have approval from the purchasing agent. So like I said, the engineer, the manager could say, oh yes, I approve, we've got funding. But unless the purchasing agent approves it and authorizes the additional money, then it's not approved. So, getting toward the end, we're in the verification phase. At Surtech, we do a lot of verification and validation of safety critical systems. It involves a lot of requirements-based testing. So our strategy is to develop test cases early on in the development lifecycle. So when the software and the hardware engineers are designing their parts of the system, we in parallel are developing our test cases. And so early on, if there are requirements that are incomplete, untestable, vague, we can raise our hand and say, hey, we've got an issue with these requirements. Let's get these fixed early on. And that improves your chances for success. But later on in the project that defects are found, the greater the cost. And then the worst thing is if the defect escapes the field, and then you've got recalls and really, really high costs to get those things fixed. Think about phase gates as you're going through the testing process. And so, for example, you get to the end of the detailed design, you had a review, all the stakeholders had their input, and you've got some action items. Once those action items are complete, now you're ready to go order your printed circuit boards. So that phase gate of the review being complete means that you're not going to order printed circuit boards until you know you've got buy-in that everything is correct and complete. Make sure that the project developers are in communication with the testers, and you'll have a better chance for success. But ultimately, you get to this stage, and once you've got all the tests complete and things passing, your project is complete. Hopefully you did it within budget. Hopefully you did it on time. But there's one more thing to do. Evaluate the project. This is a chance to analyze your return on investment and see how you did with the project. So you can compare the estimates at the beginning of the project. We thought software development was going to take 500 hours, and it took 600 hours. Or vice versa, maybe it took less time. But to Ryan's comment earlier, if you're putting your timesheet, if you're tracking time to the tasks that you're working on, now you've got that data at the end of the project, and you can compare actuals to the plan and see how you did with, and this is especially important on fixed price projects, for estimating for the next fixed price project. This is not a witch hunt. You're not trying to get anybody in trouble. It needs to be an open, safe environment for honest feedback. What did we do right? What went well? What were our successes? What went wrong? How could we improve? What can we do better next time? Maybe add some more software reviews, or add something to the process to make sure that things go smoother and that the requirements are met for the system, for the project.
You know, to that point, I've often found that I learn more from my failures than I do from my successes. And until you go back and you review what you've done, and again, like Paul said, this is not a witch hunt, and nobody should be on the offensive or be on the defensive. But, you know, we need to lay it all out. Hey, we missed the mark. Why did we miss the mark? So next time we don't.
What is your approach towards software review? How do you, I mean, if like comparing they're talking about 4 eyes, many ones, how do you go through that approach? Or just a guru versus a junior and then that way? Or how do you?
So the question is, what is the approach to software reviews? Okay. Well, first of all, you got to have somebody who has domain knowledge, either of the code or the system. of that's going to review the code. Okay, so a lot of times I find, imagine back when you were a very, very junior engineer and you could spell C, but you didn't know a lot about programming in C, and they asked you to do a code review. What are you going to do? You're going to go through that code and you're going to pick out typos in the comments, right? And you're going to think, wow, I'm doing a great job. I found like 10 typos in this thing. And the senior engineers or the engineer who wrote it's going to go, typos, really? So appropriately applying your resources is definitely key. Coding standards. How are we going to do code as a company? And then obviously requirements. Does the code meet the requirements? So those are the big things. And then obviously you have to generate some kind of artifact that you did the review. So that could be as simple as an Excel spreadsheet saying, hey, in this line do this, or in this block diagram we did this. So that would kind of be my approach.
What I'm trying to say is that, for example, you are not going to review your own code. That doesn't make sense.
And that's a great point. He says you're not going to review your own code. And that goes along with independence. And in safety and mission critical systems, highly regulated industry, independence is huge. Now, does independence mean you have to have an outside company review your code? No. But what it does mean is you cannot have written the code and do the review. So it could be somebody else in your group, it could be somebody in another group, or it could be somebody from another company. So that's a great point.
So how about generating test case? Because you get requirement from the customer, right? But you have to create a test case for what you write for code, right?
Right, so his point is talking about generating test cases. And this is kind of what the unit test I was talking about. So if you have a unit test to prove your code does what it does, it's a pretty good chance that it does do what you think it does. As long as you've tested your boundary conditions and things like that.
But do you think the programmer should write the test cases or at least minimum requirement? Because sometimes we have to create test procedure. So who should write the test procedure?
So who should write the test procedure on a piece of code? I think it would be okay if the author of the code wrote the test procedure. But again, it's got to go back to the requirements of the code. And as long as everybody agrees that the test procedure does honor the requirements, then you're good to go. Yeah. So the point is it's one thing to be able to run your code. It's another thing when you can give your code to somebody else and they try to break it. We've got a good guy at work that's good at breaking things. So yeah. Is there one more?
In terms of the lessons learned reviews, how do we ensure that communication then propagates back to the people that need to know the lessons, and then ensure that they're not swamped by a sea of best practice in a large organisation, that all the lessons learned become overriding to any actual.
Right. So his point was, how do you communicate your lessons learned with those that were involved? And a lot of times when we do this, everybody that was on the project is involved in the meeting. So, again, you got to make sure that it's a safe environment and everybody feels comfortable, but they should be involved, especially if there's things that they need to learn.
How do you then propagate that against, say, amphibious systems, 100,000 people? If it's an important lesson, how do you then propagate that back across the business such that that lesson doesn't have to be learned again and again and again?
Right.
Without swamping people with every lesson learned for everything.
Right, yeah.
I would think you would prioritize, and then probably a process change, where your process and procedures would be revised to instruct employees to, here's a change based on lessons learned. But we're a small company, less than 50 people, and we have the same issue though, and we're trying to get the word out to everybody without swamping them with too many emails.
But we also talked about other modes of communication and things like wiki pages. Like, hey, I learned if you set this bit, stuff doesn't work. And so, a well-organized wiki. Now, a lot of times with wikis, they become the wild, wild west. So a well-structured wiki with lessons learned categorized by product or categorized by subject. Here's some LabVIEW lessons learned. Here's some LabVIEW tips and tricks. So something like that might work. So you're right. You could, if you did a broadcast email to 1,000 people and 5 of them do LabVIEw, but everybody gets it, you're right. And at some point it becomes ignore, and it's ineffective at that point.
So to summarize, we've talked about the project plan, and I think the WBS is key in this planning effort, where you list out milestones, subtasks, assignments, critical path, and that can really become the basis, the blueprint, the roadmap for your project. And then all the team members can focus on that as far as priorities. And we talked about LabVIEW architecture, what's appropriate for the complexity of the project, what's appropriate for the staff that you have available to support the project. And then when you're actually doing the work and doing the project, the monitoring and control, and what's key is communication. Raising your hand to management when we've got an issue, we've got a risk, we've got a problem. Keeping everybody on the team in the loop, again, about don't just focus, some team members don't just focus on their little piece, but that they're aware of what upcoming milestones are so we can all work together to meet those interim milestones and then ultimately get the project done on time. So, any other questions?
Okay, so the question was the type of requirement that you have, that some requirements are functional requirements and some may be more of a business-related requirement. I would definitely say that if it's a functional requirement, you have to prove that it works. So a lot of times in highly regulated industries, we break down the categorization of those requirements, and if it's a functional requirement, you must show it. Some requirements you can do by inspection. So if it was a business requirement, you can look and make sure, inspect. But every requirement should need to be verified in some way, shape, or form, depending on the customer.
If you have a client that is supposed to implement X, Y, and Z kind of in tandem with your project, and then you release it, and you notice that when they did their stuff, it was done poorly, how do you tell them kind of what changed without sounding like a jerk?
Done poorly or done incorrectly. So the question was, if the customer provides part of the project and the quality is substandard.
Right. I mean, because they were, in this example, they were required to put a scanning system in, network infrastructure, and printers, and the printer would look at 600 feet away from where the operator is, so they're never going to go and run and get that and bring it back.
Right. There's a big difference between incorrect and inefficient. And so I guess it would depend on your relationship with the customer. I think if it's really a big deal that it's making issues with people who are running it, operating it, people are grumbling about it, it might be a good idea to say, hey, just so everybody knows, that wasn't on us.
Right. I mean, that's the thing. It's like, how do you kind of convey that?
But you need to build that relationship with your customer, and you need to be able to talk openly with your customer and say, hey, we're hearing a lot about where this printer's located, and is there anything we can do about that? Just want to make sure that everybody's got what they want and everybody's happy. That's a good point too. If it comes down to customer supplied something that was wrong, that may put a stop to your progress. Hey, until this gets fixed, we're on hold. We can't proceed. We're not going to work on that line of work unless it's the critical path. Any other questions?
So Surtech having the experience in sort of formal agile software development,
And if not, why not? And we have certain other companies that are doing it with LabVIEW and doing it pretty well.
So the question was mainly related to agile software development. That's something we could probably take offline. Agile is just kind of this behemoth. So, now, someone else have something else?
So what do you do when you're in the quoting stage of a project and you have a certain team, and so you quote hours that has to do with that team, but then your staff changes and you lose people or they're put on different projects and they work at completely different paces than the people you had planned on. So the scope of your project, one task should have taken 20 hours for person A, but now person A is on some other task, and person B is going to take them at least 40 hours.
So, okay, so the comment was, what happens when you have a resource reallocation and the people you were going to put on there aren't on there, and this was your A team, and they were supposed to get it done quick? You can ask Paul. He always tells me, don't quote it if you were doing it, quote it if the average person was doing it. So first of all, you need to mitigate your risk, and that happens to us a lot. You know, we quote a project and the customer sits on it for X amount of time. You know what? Our staff allocation is always changing. You know, we're not a big company. We're always changing. We're always taking on new roles. So the big thing is quote it what it's accurately going to take. Now, if you've got somebody that's like, if you're bringing up a CLAD and they're going to take a little bit longer to do something, maybe that's something that you realize that you're not going to make quite as much margin on, but it's a learning experience for that employee.
And maybe that's an internal discussion with your manager that, you know, we're not going to get this done in the hours we thought, and maybe you do or don't share it with your client. Yeah, that's a tough one.
That's a good question, though.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
So, always talking about that WBS, right?
Right.
Did you use WBS brainstorm as your video from the code, or?
So the question is WBS. Do you use WBS principles when you're developing the code?
What technician-wise or technical aspect? Because
Right.
you use WBS.
Right. You can, depending on how detailed your WBS is. So, you know, typically when Paul and I work together, you know, I'll list out all the tasks that need to be done from a technical perspective. These are the software modules that need to be created. These are, you know, what I think needs to be done. This is the estimate. Okay, then, you know, I pass that on to Paul. He does the quote. Now, when we go to implement that code, maybe we take that, maybe we didn't provide that to the customer. We just gave them a big, hey, this is what it's going to take. But now, internally, we can go through and we can say, okay, this is what I need to do. I do need to follow this work breakdown structure. I do need to track to the task. So that, good question. Anyone else?
Okay.
All right. Hey,
Well,
we have a
thank you.
booth downstairs, booth 835. Come see us if you've got questions.